Set the tone by challenging the audience's assumptions. Emphasize that when an empath stops caring, it's not coldness, it's survival. Frame it as the quiet end of emotional overextension, not the beginning of cruelty. When an empath finally stops caring, the easy narrative is to assume something broke inside them, that they became colder, more self-interested, less humane. But that story misunderstands the situation entirely. Caring was never the problem. Caring was the resource. The problem was what happened to that resource over time. Empaths don't suffer because they care too much. They suffer because they care too much. They suffer because their care is rarely met with reciprocity, respect, or responsibility. From a psychological perspective, what we're really talking about is chronic relational imbalance. The empath becomes the regulator of other people's emotions, smoothing conflict, anticipating needs often without being consciously assigned that role. And because they're good at it, because they appear calm and capable, the load increases. Not through malice most of the time, but through habit. Over time, this creates a subtle distortion. The empath's value becomes linked to what they can tolerate rather than who they are. The sensitivity, which should be a source of connection, turns into an open invitation for others to offload discomfort. Philosophically, this echoes an old pattern. When compassion is unbounded by limits, it stops being a virtue and becomes a form of self-erasure. From a trauma-informed lens, many empaths learned early that care was a currency for safety. If I understand you, if I soothe you, if I stay attuned, then maybe I belong. That adaptive strategy works in childhood, but it becomes costly in adulthood. The nervous system stays in a state of hypervigilance, constantly scanning for emotional shifts, constantly adjusting. Eventually, the body keeps the score. Fatigue sets in, resentment quietly grows, and not because the empath has become less loving, but because love without boundaries is unsustainable. So when the empath stops caring, what they're actually doing is withdrawing from an unequal contract. They're no longer willing to participate in relationships where empathy flows in one direction and accountability in the other. This isn't a moral failure. It's a corrective response. It's the psyche saying, this arrangement is no longer safe. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Many people don't miss the empath as a person. They miss the role. They miss the emotional buffering, the constant understanding, the soft landing. That's why the shift feels so jarring. The empath hasn't changed their values. They've changed their availability. This moment marks the beginning of psychological differentiation. Care becomes a choice instead of an obligation. Empathy is no longer automatic, it's discerning. And paradoxically, this is when care becomes healthier, not smaller. If there's one thing to reflect on, it's this. Compassion without self-respect is not kindness, it's depletion. And no one heals the world by disappearing from themselves. What often goes unseen in the story of the empath is not the care in itself, but the cost of sustaining it. Emotional burnout doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't arrive as a dramatic breakdown or a single breaking point. It accumulates quietly, invisibly, in the background of everyday interactions. The empath keeps showing up, keeps listening, keeps giving the benefit of the doubt, long after their internal reserves are running low. From a psychological standpoint, this kind of burnout is not about weakness. It's about prolonged stress without recovery. The empath's nervous system is frequently activated, tuned to other people's moods, disappointments, and unspoken needs. This constant attunement keeps the body in a low-grade fight or flight state. Over time, the stress hormones don't shut off. The body adapts, but at a cost. What looks like emotional strength from the outside is often physiological depletion on the inside. What makes this burnout especially difficult to recognize is that empaths are rarely asked how they're doing in a meaningful way. They're seen as the strong ones, the calm ones, the ones who can handle it. So the empath learns to minimize their own fatigue. They tell themselves it's not that bad, that others have it worse, that caring is just who they are. This self-silencing becomes another layer of exhaustion. Philosophically, we might say this is what happens when being needed replaces being known. The empath's identity becomes wrapped around usefulness. They are valued for their availability, not their authenticity. And when your sense of worth is tied to how much you can carry, Rest starts to feel like failure. Saying no feels like abandonment. Stepping back feels selfish, even when the body is begging for relief. Eventually, the signs appear, but they're subtle. Irritability, where there used to be patience. Numbness, where there used to be warmth. A sense of distance, not because the empath no longer cares, but because caring has begun to hurt. This is not indifference. It's the psyche's last attempt at self-protection. Here's the crucial point. Burnout is not a personal flaw. It's a relational signal. It tells us that something in the system is unsustainable. When an empath finally pulls away, it's often after countless internal negotiations, after trying to adjust, explain, forgive, and endure. The withdrawal is not impulsive. It's the end of a long process of being unheard. And the tragedy is that burnout is frequently mistaken for emotional coldness. But what has really disappeared is not empathy. It's excess. What's gone is the overfunctioning, the emotional labor that kept everyone else comfortable at the empath's expense. The invitation here is simple but profound. If you recognize yourself in this pattern, don't wait until numbness becomes your boundary. Burnout is not a failure to love. It's a demand to change how and for whom you give your energy. After burnout, what often emerges is something that looks like emotional distance. And this is where misunderstanding deepens. Detachment is quickly labeled as coldness, indifference, even punishment. But psychologically speaking, detachment is not the absence of care. It's the presence of clarity. It's the moment when the empath stops confusing responsibility for others with responsibility to themselves. For much of their lives, empaths are deeply identified with emotional fusion. They feel what others feel, often before those people are even aware of it themselves. This can create closeness, but it can also erase boundaries. When another person is upset, the empath feels compelled to fix it. When there's tension, they rush to resolve it. Over time, this reflex becomes automatic. There's no pause to ask, is this mine to carry? Detachment begins when that pause finally appears. From a trauma-informed perspective, this shift is not a rejection of connection. It's a nervous system learning safety. When the empath allows themselves to step back emotionally, the body is given permission to regulate. The constant vigilance eases. There's space to breathe, to observe rather than absorb. This is not cruelty. It's recalibration. Philosophically, detachment has long been misunderstood. We tend to associate it with apathy, but in many wisdom traditions, detachment is what allows ethical action. When you're no longer entangled in the need to be liked, needed, or approved of, you can respond instead of react. The empath who detaches is not withdrawing love. They are removing compulsion from love. What often unsettles others is the change in dynamics. The empath stops rescuing. They stop anticipating needs that were never voiced. They stop questioning consequences. This can feel jarring to people who unconsciously relied on that emotional labor, but discomfort in others is not evidence of wrongdoing. It's often the first sign that a healthier balance is being introduced. Detachment also brings discernment. The empath begins to notice patterns they once rationalized away. They see where empathy was being used as access rather than connection, where vulnerability was one-sided, where understanding was expected but rarely returned. With this clarity comes a quieter strength. There's less explaining, less defending, less emotional negotiation. Importantly, detachment does not mean disengaging from humanity. It means engaging with limits. The empath still cares, but selectively. Their compassion becomes grounded rather than reflexive. They can witness suffering without losing themselves inside it. And paradoxically, this makes their presence more authentic, not less. This is the point where self-respect begins to take root, not as arrogance, not as superiority, but as an internal alignment. The empath no longer betrays themselves in order to preserve harmony. They accept that not every rupture is theirs to repair. If there's one truth to carry forward, it's this. Detachment is not the end of love, it's the end of self-abandonment, and only from that place can connection become genuinely free. One of the most noticeable shifts once an empath begins to detach is the disappearance of over-explaining. For a long time, words were their primary tool for maintaining connection. They clarified intentions, softened truths, justified boundaries before they were even set. Over-explaining was not a communication style. It was a survival strategy. It was an attempt to ensure safety by being understood. Psychologically, this pattern often comes from early environments where misunderstanding carried consequences. If you learned that being misread meant conflict, withdrawal, or emotional loss, you developed a reflex to preempt it. You explained yourself thoroughly, carefully, repeatedly, not to persuade, but to prevent rupture. The empath learned that clarity could keep relationships intact, even when clarity came at the expense of their own needs. But something changes after burnout and detachment. The empath begins to recognize a quiet truth. People who are committed to misunderstanding you will do so regardless of how clearly you speak. Over-explaining does not create safety in relationships that are fundamentally unsafe. It only delays the inevitable. From a nervous system perspective, silence becomes regulation. When the empath stops rehearsing explanations in their head, stops anticipating objections, stops justifying their inner reality, the body settles. There is less cognitive load, less emotional strain. The absence of constant narration creates space for presence. Philosophically, silence has a different function than speech. Speech tries to shape perception. Silence reveals reality. When the empath no longer fills the gaps, the truth of the relationship becomes visible. Who respects boundaries without negotiation? Who responds with curiosity instead of defensiveness? Who only engages when emotional labor is available? Silence answers questions that words never could. This shift is often misinterpreted as withdrawal or punishment. But silence here is not passive aggression, it's alignment. The empath is no longer willing to contort themselves into coherence for others. They trust that what is meant to stay will not require constant explanation. Importantly, this doesn't mean the empath stops communicating altogether. It means communication becomes intentional. Fewer words, clearer boundaries, less emotional cushioning. There's a confidence that wasn't there before, not the confidence of certainty, but the confidence of self-trust. The empath knows their experience is valid even if it isn't immediately validated by others. In this quiet, something profound happens. The empath stops chasing closure. They realize that closure is not something granted by another person's understanding. It's something generated internally. When the need to be fully understood dissolves, the need to prove one's worth dissolves with it. And here is a reflection to carry with you. When you stop over-explaining, you're not giving up your voice. You're reclaiming it. Silence, when chosen consciously, is not absence. It's integrity. There's a moment that often comes later, sometimes long after the empath has gone quiet, stepped back, or emotionally disengaged. It's the moment when other people finally feel the absence, not intellectually, not conceptually, but viscerally. The room feels colder, conversations feel flatter, conflicts escalate faster, and only then does awareness begin to dawn. What's important to understand is that this realization rarely happens while the empath is still giving. As long as someone is absorbing tension, translating emotions, softening edges, and offering understanding, the system appears functional. The empath's presence acts like emotional insulation. It buffers discomfort. It delays consequences. It keeps relationships operating above their actual capacity for honesty and accountability. Psychologically, this is how imbalance hides. When one person consistently overfunctions, others are spared from confronting their own underfunctioning. Needs don't have to be articulated clearly. Emotional regulation doesn't have to be learned. Repair doesn't have to be mutual. The empath's care fills the gaps. And because this care is quiet and relational rather than transactional, it often goes unnoticed until it's gone. When the empath withdraws, the system destabilizes. People are suddenly left with their own feelings, their own reactions, their own unresolved patterns. Conflicts that were once gently managed now feel sharper. Emotional labor that was once outsourced now has to be internalized. And that can be deeply uncomfortable. Philosophically, this speaks to a broader truth about value. We often don't recognize what sustains us until it stops. Not because we're malicious, but because familiarity breeds invisibility. The empath's constancy becomes part of the background. Their patience is assumed. Their understanding is expected. Only its absence reveals how much was being held. This is also why the empath shift is sometimes met with anger rather than reflection. Loss is easier to externalize than to examine. It's more comfortable to accuse the empath of changing than to ask what their presence had been compensating for all along. But blame is a defense against insight. What's crucial here is that the empath does not owe anyone continued access to their emotional labor in order to teach this lesson. The realization is not something they orchestrate. It's a natural consequence of rebalancing. When someone stops overgiving, the truth of the relationship surfaces on its own. And here's the paradox. The empath is often finally seen only when they stop trying to be seen. When they stop proving their worth through availability, their absence becomes the message. Not as punishment, not as manipulation, but as reality. This can be painful for everyone involved. But it's also an opportunity. For others, it's a chance to grow, to take responsibility, to develop capacities that were never required before. For the empath, it's confirmation that their exhaustion was not imagined. So the reflection I leave you with is this. If your absence creates more truth than your presence ever did, don't rush to fill the space. Let the clarity do its work. What ultimately emerges when an empath stops caring in the old way is not emptiness, but protection. This is where the narrative often gets it wrong. People assume the empath has shut their heart down. In reality, the heart is very much alive. It's just no longer unguarded. What changes is not the capacity for care, but the conditions under which care is given. Psychologically, this marks a major developmental shift. The empath moves from indiscriminate empathy to embodied discernment. They begin to sense, often viscerally, where their care is nourishing and where it is draining. This isn't intellectual judgment, it's nervous system intelligence. The body now participates in decision-making. Tightness, fatigue, dread, these are no longer ignored in the name of being kind. They're treated as information. From a trauma-informed perspective, this is healing. Many empaths were conditioned to override their internal signals in order to maintain connection. Protection was learned as abandonment, boundaries as rejection. Reclaiming those signals restores a sense of agency that may have been missing for decades. The empath no longer needs to rationalize their limits. They feel them and they honor them. Philosophically, this is the difference between generosity and self-sacrifice. A protected heart does not give less, it gives truthfully. Care is no longer compulsive or driven by fear of loss. It's rooted in choice. And when care is chosen freely, it carries a different quality, more grounded, more sustainable, more honest. This is also where relationships begin to reorganize. Some deepen, some fall away. Not because the empath has become difficult, but because the terms have changed. Access is no longer automatic. Intimacy now requires reciprocity. Emotional closeness requires accountability. For people capable of meeting the empath in this new space, the connection becomes richer. For others, the distance feels sudden, but it was always there, hidden by overgiving. What's important to emphasize is that protection is not bitterness. A protected heart is not closed. It's selective. It recognizes that empathy is a powerful force, and like any powerful force, it requires containment. Without boundaries, empathy erodes the self. With boundaries, it becomes a stabilizing presence. This stage often brings a quiet confidence. The empath no longer needs to announce their growth or justify their choices. There's less urgency to be understood, less fear of being misjudged. Self-trust replaces external validation. The question shifts from how do I keep this connection to does this connection honor who I am now? And perhaps most importantly, the empath rediscovers joy, not the performative joy of being needed, but the grounded joy of being aligned. Energy returns, curiosity returns, creativity returns. Care becomes something they offer, not something that drains them. So here's the closing reflection to carry with you. A protected heart is not a hardened one. It's a wise one. And when empathy is guided by self-respect, it doesn't disappear. It finally becomes sustainable.